So one concept that really bothers some people is the notion of white privilege. And when someone is confronted with the claim that they have white privilege, they often respond with anger because they see it as an insult. And one common sort of internet response is something like, you know, they must have run out of white privilege when I was in line because I've had to work my ass off my whole life. And so people often see this claim of white privilege to be saying to them, oh, you've had it super easy, everything was just handed to you on a silver platter, you've had to make no effort. And everyone who's not born, into a rich family, they've had to work. They've had to probably, work very hard to achieve their success. And so it can seem very insulting to people to have someone say to them, we got white privilege, because from their perspective, they've had to work for things. And they, in fact, have had to work for things. So how can white privilege be explained in a way that is consistent with a person having to work really hard, but still have some sort of privilege or advantage? Well, one way to do this is to turn to role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. Role-playing games, for those who are only not familiar or only slightly familiar with them, involve, pretending to be someone else in a fictional world, which has a set of rules that let you resolve things typically by rolling dice to simulate the apparent randomness of reality. So if you're going to go, stab something with your sword or fire your phased plasma rifle at it, you typically roll like a die and try to achieve a certain number to hit it, and then you do damage, etc. Now, one game that I played for a really, really long time is Dungeons and Dragons. Played it way back when it was, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The 5th edition introduced a concept of rolling with advantage and also rolling with disadvantage. So what does that mean if you're not familiar with the rule system? Well, the idea is this. Normally when you roll stuff, when you're rolling, you normally would roll a single die, like a d20, which I rolled off camera, in order to hit something. Now, if you're rolling with advantage, what you end up doing is you end up rolling, instead of just one die, you roll 2 dice. So you get 2 chances, and you select the higher die. So if you have advantage, it's easier to do things. And if you have disadvantage, you also roll 2 dice, but you have to take the lower of them. And so having advantage doesn't mean you always succeed, it just makes it easier to succeed. And having disadvantage doesn't mean you always fail, it's just easier to fail. So to give like a D&D example, suppose we've got 2 D&D characters, got my paladin, and we've got KT, the monk who fights with the Wu-Tang style. And we're heading to a small town to meet up with our companions at the Indignant Gecko. And we come across a merchant wagon, and they've been slaughtered, and we go to investigate, following the trail of blood. And we come across an ogre. And so being good characters, seeing the ogres gnawing on the bodies of some victims, we of course rush in to attack the ogre, because that's what you do in D&D. So initially when we attack the ogre, it's just us against the ogre, so we'd roll normally. But suppose my paladin, I have the ability to smack things with my shield and knock him down. And I succeed, we topple the ogre, and now I have advantage over the ogre, because it's easier for me to hit the ogre. And of course also I confer this advantage to my friend, because if the ogre's on the ground, then it's easier for him to hit it as well. And so in that scenario, it's not guaranteed that I'm going to hit the ogre. I could still roll terribly and miss, but I'm more likely to succeed. Now, if the ogre tries to attack me from the ground, he's going to have a harder time hitting me. He's going to roll with disadvantage. Doesn't mean he can't hit me and kill me. It means it's harder for him to succeed. Now, suppose we dispatch the ogre, get our loot and XP, and then we head to town. And unknown to us, this town is part of a great empire that was built upon enslaving certain humans that, much like our own country, if you're a white human, you're much better off, and they enslaved humans with dark skin. But we don't know this. So we go into town, we've recovered some items from the Ogre that clearly belong to people in the town. We find, say, some holy water, and we find some stuff that belongs to the merchants. So we get to town, and Katie and I, we say, okay, we'll split up. A paladin, I'll take the holy water to the church. Katie says, well, I'll take these stolen goods to the merchants. And so suppose we're going through town, and I'm a paladin, so I'm wearing full plate armor. I've got sword, probably a couple swords, lots of weapons, and so I'm a pretty imposing figure. KT's a monk, so he just looks like an armed person just walking through town. So suppose the local guards come up and decide to interrogate me, and one thing the dungeon master would have us do is we'd have to roll to we talk to the guards and try to convince them that I'm here on legitimate business and there's no reason for them to fight. And I could fail, but I have in this case, suppose the DM, knowing that this is a racist town, says that, okay, since I'm a human with white skin, the guards see me as as white, and so I'm allowed to roll with advantage. So I could still fail and get in trouble and end up in a fight with the guards, but I'm far more likely to succeed because I get 2 chances. So suppose they come up to me and say, what's your business? And I reply back, and they're convinced that I'm okay despite all my weapons, and I go on and do my business. And then suppose KT encounters guards as well, see him going through town. He's in a wealthy part of town. He's a monk. He doesn't look like he belongs there, and so they stop him and question him. Now, he might be okay, because just like before, he gets to roll to see if he can convince the militia not to harm him or attack him, but he's rolling with disadvantage, because the background of this town is it's an empire that was built on on racism and slavery, and there's still remnants of that. So anyone who's a human who has dark skin rolls with disadvantage. Now he could still roll really well, and still tell them that he's on legitimate business, and they could be fine to go on their way. But unfortunately, one of the rolls was a 3, and so that goes over badly. And so the guards respond negatively, perhaps violence ensues. And so you can think of white privilege in that kind of scenario. It's like rolling with advantage. It's not that you always succeed. It's not that it's super easy all the time. But if you're rolling with advantage, you're more likely to succeed. And if you're rolling with disadvantage, it's not that you can't succeed, it's that it's harder to succeed. Now, one clear difference is, of course, when you're rolling in D&D, you know when you're rolling with advantage, because the Dungeon Master says to you, roll with advantage. So you know it's going to be easier. And if things are going, hard, then the DM says, roll with disadvantage. And you know that. But in life, of course, we don't know what we're rolling. And so one way to look at white privilege, and this horribly oversimplifies it, is to think of it that when, say, a person goes to a bank and they're white, and they're talking to the banker, asking for a loan, they get to roll with advantage. Doesn't mean they're going to succeed, but they're more likely to do so. Or when they apply for a job, they get to roll with advantage, so they're more likely to do so. Now, in the case of real life, of course, you don't know you're rolling with advantage, so all you see is the results. Similarly, if someone's facing prejudice and bias, it's like rolling with disadvantage. They have a harder time. So, in the game system, they would roll twice, taking the worst one. And again, in real life, you don't realize this is happening because it's not a game where you get to see your dice. So the person could, of course, succeed in the face of prejudice and bias, but they're more likely to fail. So the way to look at white privilege in this context is not that white privilege is like a magical success where you just get to, in game terms, always take like 20, where you automatically succeed on on everything. Rather, again, you can think of it as rolling with advantage. It's like you get 2 rolls at everything if you're white, and you're more likely to succeed. It still can be difficult. You can still fail totally, but if you're not white, if you're a minority, you're rolling with disadvantage. You can totally succeed, but you're more likely to fail. Now this analogy metaphor, of course, is incredibly simplified, and it's really easy to quickly punch lots of holes into it in terms of like how the analogy to rolling, etc. And obviously it incredibly simplifies things because in the real world you're not just dealing with, say, your skin color. You're also dealing with factors like economic class, your appearance. And so if you wanted to model racism in a game, you would need more than disadvantage and disadvantage, but this does provide kind of a basic analogy. So again, white privilege doesn't mean that you get to take 20 in everything and always succeed super easy. It just means that things are somewhat easier. In fact, it might be better because the term privilege has now become somewhat challenging. One could alternatively refer to it as white advantage, although that may be a bad idea because it's already been established as a term. And so that is the analogy.